I'm Carly, and I want to teach you how to make this patchwork pillow. Well, actually, I want to teach you how to sew, but in order to teach you to sew, I'm going to teach you how to make this patchwork pillow. This video is part of a series, so I'm not going to go over how to thread the machine, the essential supplies you need, or the basics about fabric. If you don't know those things, go and watch the first video in this series instead. In this tutorial, I'll cover the basics of measuring and cutting, sewing straight, backstitching and pivoting, ironing, and even hand sewing with the invisible stitch. By the end, you'll not only have a pillow, but you'll also have the skills to make so many other cool projects. So let's get started. For this project, you'll need an ironing board, an iron, a sewing machine, a ruler, fabric, matching thread, scissors, marking tools, measuring tape, pins, a needle, a seam ripper, and a can-do attitude. In order to make our pattern pieces, we'll need to determine the dimensions of our pillow insert. Drape your measuring tape over the top of the pillow at the fluffiest point, from seam to seam. My pillow insert measured 18 by 18 inches. If I cut my fabric to exactly that, however, the pillowcase will be too small for the pillow insert, so we need to add seam allowance as well as some ease. For this particular project, I'm going to add 1.5 inches to every single measurement. This means my new measurements will be 19.5 by 19.5. What I have here is my pattern piece for the back. I will only need to cut one of these. For the front side of the pillow, I will cut one rectangle for each print of fabric. The measurements for the front side of the pillow are a little more complicated. I'm going to draw it out to show you what I'm doing, but at the end I'll give you an equation that you can use for your particular pillow insert. So what we're going to do is we're going to use two different fabrics for the front. So I'm just going to draw a line to indicate those fabrics here. Again, if we were to just cut this and sew it back together, it would end up too small because of the seam allowance that we need. So I'm going to draw the seam allowance here. So this symbolizes us cutting it straight down the middle and then sewing it back together. After we do that, we're going to cut it the opposite direction. Change my color to indicate that. We'll cut it down the middle this way, and then we will sew it back together. We've got these lines drawn, but probably makes it a bit confusing. First, the green lines will be cut prior to sewing anything. The orange lines will be cut after we've sewn some stuff together. So the green lines, add 0.5 inches to each section. And that is reflected down below with our height. So let's go over that one first. So what we'll do is we'll take the height, the new number right here. We'll divide it by 2 because we're going to have 1 and 2 different pieces. And then we're going to add the 0.5, which is that seam allowance right there. And so that creates our front piece height measurement. So for me, let me see here if I've got 19.5 as my height. I divide that by 2. That's 9.75. And then I'm going to add 0.5, which equals 10.25, and this is my new front height. For the length, our length is 19.5, and we are not going to cut that in half because we need the full length for this measurement. Instead, we're going to add a full inch because now we got 0.5 and 0.5, and both of those seam allowances need to be accounted for. So our length then is going to be, for me, 19.5 plus just 1 inch, and that equals 20.5 for me. And so this would be my measurements for the two front pieces. So all in all for me, I need 3 pieces cut. I need the back piece, which is 19.5 by 19.5, and I need 2 front pieces out of different fabrics. So my polka dot and my floral are representing those. And like I said, that was 10.25 by 20.5 for each of those. Hooray! The fabric I selected for this project is non-stretch. It's a quilting cotton for the front and a lightweight canvas for the back. It's important to iron your fabric before beginning, and for this project, the pattern won't be cut on the fold, so I'm ironing it entirely open. If you're unfamiliar with irons, be sure to pay attention to the steam settings for your type of fabric. I'm using a quilter's cotton, which can handle quite a lot of heat and steam. Pre-ironing fabric also gives you the opportunity to catch any damage to your material before you start the project. To prevent burning your fabric, don't hold the iron on the fabric for too long. Also, keep your iron upright when you're not using it. Your project is only going to be as good as you cut it, so we want to be careful to measure and cut well. Here are some tips I have for measuring using one of these large clear rulers. When you lay out the fabric on the table, make sure that it is smooth before marking. Start by identifying the grain line of the fabric. It will be going parallel to the selvage edge of your fabric. Work in the corner to save the remaining fabric for future projects. Create your first line going along the selvage edge and mark the corner with a little line. Using that first line as a guide, create the perpendicular lines by using the inches in the clear ruler. Make sure to hold the ruler down firmly as you're creating these marks. If it moves even a little, your project will turn out kind of strange. Always check before cutting. Up here it's 9. Down here, 9 1/8. So let's redraw this line. And that's why we always check. When cutting fabric, you want to keep the fabric flat on the table. If it is bunched up like this, you might accidentally be cutting secret layers underneath. So we keep it nice and flat and open. As we cut, we want to keep our scissors as close to the table as possible. I tend to use my other hand to sort of help lift the fabric just a little, but not all the way up in the air. As you cut, you want to take long, smooth strokes. It's finally time to sew, and by that, I mean pin. If we were to put the fabrics through the machine without pins, anything could happen. And so we want to hold things together. Using a sewing machine is stressful enough, so let's not fight with our fabric too. When we pin, we want to work with right sides of fabric together. That's because when sewn together, all of the raw edges will be inside the project and the outside of our project will look so nice. I have my fabrics right sides together and I plan on sewing this edge of the fabric. It's helpful to hold tension in the fabric. Hold the fabric with one hand like this and use your wrist to hold down the other side. Then you have these fingers to be able to stab in, up, and through. You might need to use your fingers on the back side to push the pin in or your thumb on the front side to pull the fabric down. If you're wondering how far apart the pins need to be, it kind of depends on the fabric. With something like a stiff cotton like this, maybe 1 thumbs up length, holding tension in, up, and through. Check that the fabrics are still aligned. If I pin and I see too much of the polka dots peeking out, I need to pull that pin out and start over. Remember, the way you pin is the way that you sew. In order to sew straight, we need to know a little bit more about our sewing machine. This is the presser foot. You have to put the presser foot down before sewing no matter what. The presser foot holds the fabric to the machine, and underneath the presser foot are the feed dogs. These grab the fabric and move it to the back of the machine. Let's do a little experiment to see what it looks like to sew without touching the fabric at all. The machine did the work to move it forward, however it veered off to the side. This is helpful information. Now we know that we can trust the machine to move the fabric along, but it does need our help guiding it left and right. So as I'm sewing, I'm looking at the edge of the presser foot. That's because this is where I want the edge of the fabric to line up. So I'm going along and I'm not pushing, I'm not pulling, I'm just guiding. Really, my job is more to be concerned with going left or right and less to do with going in or out. As I sew, it may look like my left hand is pushing the fabric to the back, but really I am barely touching the fabric and I'm moving it just gently left and right as needed. There's one problem, however. My 2 pieces of fabric are actually quite easy to pull apart. If I were to wash this project, all my hard work would unravel. So to fix that problem, we need a backstitch. Backstitching is when you sew backwards at the beginning and the end of any stitch that you're creating. Press your foot down. I will sew a few stitches forward. Once I've made it into the project, I will then reverse stitch a few stitches. This is basically like tying a knot at the beginning of your thread. Then I will sew forward as planned. Once I get to the end of the stitching line, I will go all the way to the edge and then reverse stitch a few stitches. Now I would find it very difficult to pull this stitching line apart. For this project, we're working with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That means that the edge of the fabric needs to be 1/2 of an inch away from where our stitches are going to be placed. In order to map that out as we're moving through our project, we need to set some things up to start. Right now, my needle is about 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of my presser foot. I love to use my presser foot as my guide for my seam allowance, and so I'm going to change my needle position to the left-hand side. With my needle on the left-hand side, I am at exactly a 1/2 inch away from the edge of the presser foot. So once again, as I feed the fabric through the machine, I can line up this raw edge with the edge of my presser foot. I will know that my needle is going in about a 1/2 inch away from the edge. If I'm working with a seam allowance that doesn't line up conveniently with my presser foot, I can use these lines as a guide instead. However, I find those hard to see, so my favorite technique is just to get some blue tape and to make my own guideline with that. Now it's finally time to actually sew our project. I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with the edge of my presser foot and put my presser foot down. I'll start taking pins out as soon as they get close to this presser foot. So I will start sewing forward and then work my way backwards to backstitch. From there, I will continue going forward. I'm helping the fabric rotate left and right, but not forward or backwards. As I come up to this next pin, I stop, pull the pin out, and then continue. As I'm working, my eyes are here, always watching the edge of the presser foot meet the edge of the fabric. Another pin, so I stop, pull it out, and set it aside. It's pretty normal in sewing to be starting and stopping as you are sewing one seam. As I reach the edge of this seam, I go all the way to the end of the fabric and then backstitch a few stitches. Pull it off, cut the thread, and hooray! First seam is done. This doesn't look like the original patchwork design, and so we'll need to practice a new skill, trusting the process. Although it doesn't look right now, it will shortly. First, we're going to measure halfway through this line. Then, using the ruler, I will line up one of these lines with the line that we sewed, hold it down firmly with my opposite hand, check that it's still lined up, and measure. Then, taking my scissors, I'll cut that line. Now that it's cut, you can rotate one side so that the fabrics are now opposite each other. Because I want these seams to line up precisely when we sew them together, I'm going to be very careful about pinning them so that they match up. I'm going to line them up very carefully, and I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to pin them in place. Notice that this time I'm pinning perpendicular to the edge of the fabric instead of parallel. That will keep these exactly together. There won't be any chance that they move whatsoever. Then I will continue pinning the edges of the project. As I get close to the seams that I want to stitch down, I might stop, pull my presser foot up, and check that they are still lying flat. Now we need to press this seam open, add some steam and pressure to open the seam up. Then I press from the outside just to really make it crisp. Oh, it looks so good. At this point, it is important that you admire your work. Wow! When we sew the front and back pieces, we are going to be starting here, sewing all the way around and ending here. That will give us an opening that allows us to turn it right sides out. What I like to do is pick a particular pin that I can recognize as a start and a stop pin. I'll start right here, pin all the way around, and then I plan to end my sewing right here. Or you could take your pen and mark where you plan to start and where you plan to stop. All right, presser foot down, pin out. This was my starting pin, and I'm gonna go forward a few stitches and then backwards a few stitches. All right, so I've backstitched. Let's go forward. As you can see, I'm running out of fabric to sew. I want to go this way. So what I'm going to do is anchor my needle into my project, pick up my presser foot, and rotate the project around. Now that I've rotated, I'm going to put my presser foot back down. I need to still be sewing at about a 1/2 inch, and this is, in my opinion, close enough. If we wanted to make sure it was exact, rotate it back, go one more stitch, rotate again, and there we go. It's lined up nice with the edge. Now we'll sew forward. So you only needed to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and that was what we marked with these 2 pins. Before flipping these right side out, we need to clip the corners. This will help our corners look sharp and won't be filled with all this bulky fabric. Now we can flip our pillowcase right sides out. What you want to do is get all the way into these corners until they are nice and pointy. Sometimes it's helpful to use a pen to really push out those corners. Now that it is right sides out, we need to press this down. I like to use my fingers to massage the seams all the way to the edge so that I'm not pressing them tucked into one another. This is my opening right here. What we need to do is make sure to press a 1/2 inch tucked inward so that the seam allowance is the same from where we sewed it by machine and sewed it by hand. Because it's already sewn on the sides, the easiest way to do this is just to pull and pinch. So with it pulled like that, I will be able to just press right down. This will give us a nice smooth edge for us to hand stitch. Our next task is to wrestle this pillow insert into our pillowcase. I like to roll it up as small as I can. Just gotta work it a little bit at a time. This project is a little bit of a balance between making this opening big enough that the pillow can fit, but not so big that we have to hand sew forever. Okay. Starting to really look like a pillow. Last step, we need to close up this opening. Before stitching our pillow closed, it's helpful to pin the 2 sides together so that as we stitch, we're not fighting with the pillow insert. So push the pillow insert out of the way, pinch and pull the opening closed, and start putting pins in a few inches away from the edge. In order to get even stitches, I like to mark where I plan to stitch along the entire edge. This is where we backstitched with the machine. From there, I'll go about 3/16 of the way and I'll mark it. So mark dots all the way along this edge where we plan to stitch. You want to make sure that your markings are on both sides of this opening. A little bit on the back and a little bit on the front. Eventually, when we stitch those together, those dots will line up. I will be using a contrasting color thread so that you can see the process better. You should pick out a thread that's going to blend in with your fabric. It's time to hand sew. I have my needle and I have my thread, and what we need to do is put a knot at the end of our thread. Typically, if we try to knot thread, we'll just, tie the thread into a knot. That's fine, except for that knot is extremely small, and if I want to make it bigger, I have to have impeccable aim to try to knot right on top of the other knot I missed. So, I want to show you a way to make a knot at the end of thread where you can control how big or small you want it to be. Just like that. To demonstrate, I found the biggest needle in my house and I threaded it with some yarn. I like to keep one end shorter and one longer. With my left hand, I'm going to hold the needle, and with my right hand, I'm going to take the long end of the thread. Next, I'm going to put the long end of the thread on top of the needle and transfer it into my left hand. At this point, it's creating a circle. From here, with my right hand, I grab the thread and I wrap it around the needle. However many times you wrap it around the needle will be how big the knot becomes. So I'm starting with 4. Let's see how big that knot becomes. Here's the tricky part. From here, you'll need to, with your right hand, grab onto the needle, and with your left hand, grab onto those spirals that you've created. Pinch those spirals in your left hand and do not let them go. Keep holding on as you pull with your right hand the needle and all of the thread through those loop-de-loops. Keep pinching, don't let go. As you pull, you'll feel the knot form between your fingers, and when you feel the knot, then okay, you can let go. And hooray, we've made a knot. Cut off the little tail and we're ready to sew. I know what you're thinking, but I'm left-handed. Not a problem, so am I. Take the needle in your right hand and hold the long end of your thread in your left hand. Take the end of the long end and put it on top of the needle. Pinch that with your right hand. So look at the screen. We've got a circle created where the end of our thread and our needle are both pinched in our right hand. Now with your left hand, take the thread and wrap it around the needle. Here's the tricky part. We have to transfer all these loop-de-loops into our thumb and forefinger of our left hand. Once that's done, then our right hand is free to grab the needle and pull through the loop-de-loops. Continue pinching as hard as you can with your thumb and forefinger. Do not lose all those little loop-de-loops. As you pull, the short end will come out of your thumb and forefinger, and that's when we need to grab a hold of that so that we don't pull that out of our needle. Continue pulling until you feel a knot form underneath your thumb, and there we go. We have a knot. To begin, we'll want to hide the knot of our thread inside the project. So we'll open up the opening and take the needle and carefully bring the needle up through the seam allowance until it comes out the folded edge at our first blue dot. By starting this way, the knot is now hidden inside the seam allowance. Now that the thread is coming up through the project, we're going to go straight across to the next blue dot and put our needle in. Before pulling it all the way through, you can actually push the needle back up out the next blue dot on the matching side. So if you're looking closely, I'm coming up through the yellow, going across to the red, in and up through the red again. Then I will pull that all the way through. From here, I will go straight across to the yellow once more, go in the next blue dot, in at this dot, up through the next blue dot, and pull through. If you've done that successfully, then you have your first ladder stitch. You continue that process all the way across the opening until it is at the end. Even with the contrasting color thread, it's super hard to see the stitches that I've made. When it gets a little tricky and I accidentally stab to the outside, I undo that and instead I sort of roll the seam allowance open until there's something I can stab into, up, and through the next blue hole. Okay. You've successfully reached the end of the opening and you've sewn it closed. Now we need to add a knot to the end of this whole stitching line. In order to do that, I go into the fabric just a little bit with the needle, and as I'm pulling it out, it creates this loop. Before the loop closes entirely, I put the needle through the loop and pull. This creates a little knot right here. I'll do this another 2 or 3 times until it feels secure. The final step is to take the needle, go through the knot, and into the pillow. Pull it through the side of the fabric and clip the tail. This tucks the tail inside the pillow. Now I can see my little knot a little bit because it's black thread, but if you had matching thread, then you're good to go. The final step is to erase the marker with some water. Congratulations, you finished your first sewing project. That was awesome. You crushed it. I hope I see you in the next video when we learn about hemming and creating tubes out of fabric and maybe zigzag stitching. It just keeps getting better.